Biden is backing major Supreme Court reforms. Here's what they would do. Woo!
All right.
Finally.
Yes.
Finally,
you hear that,
they're
folks?
going to reform the Supreme Court. We're going to get a constitutional amendment and stuff. All right. So to get people excited about the election, that's really the only way to interpret this. Or maybe the part of Biden's brain that's still functioning just really doesn't want to be remembered as the guy on that debate stage. Maybe he's desperately trying to do some stuff to be remembered by.
Could be.
President Biden on Monday unveiled a trio of proposals to reform the Supreme Court, calling on Congress to pass legislation setting term limits for justices and establishing binding enforceable ethics rules for the nation's highest court. Mr. Biden's proposed reforms come after the Supreme Court, which has a 6-3 conservative majority, issued a series of landmark decisions in recent years that have upended longstanding rules on abortion, affirmative action in higher education, and federal regulatory power. Those decisions, as well as scrutiny over ethics practices at the high court, have made it a target of Democrats and liberal advocacy groups who have argued the Supreme Court has undermined public confidence in itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, it didn't just do that. The public regard for the Supreme Court has never been the same after the 2000 election.
No,
when you saw how the Supreme Court split on Bush v. Gore purely on party lines, the idea that SCOTUS was above politics was just completely shattered. They never had the same level of respect again.
Gotta love that illusion.
Yeah, exactly. It shattered the illusion. Two of Mr. Biden's three proposed changes, term limits and a binding code of conduct, would require action from Congress, making it highly unlikely they will become law before the president leaves office in January 2025. His third reform is a constitutional amendment that clarifies that no president is immune from prosecution for crimes committed while in office. That proposal is Mr. Biden's answer to the Supreme Court's ruling earlier this month, finding that the former president, Donald Trump, cannot be prosecuted for official acts taken while in the White House. The first measure put forth by Mr. Biden is an amendment to the Constitution called the No One is Above the Law Amendment, which would state that the Constitution doesn't grant immunity from federal criminal indictment, trial, conviction, or sentencing to a former president, according to the White House. The second would do away with lifetime appointments for members of the Supreme Court and instead set 18-year term limits. Under Mr. Biden's plan, the president would appoint a new justice every 2 years, who would then serve for 18 years. The president's third proposal is a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court, which would require justices in part to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, and step aside from cases in which they or their spouses have financial or other conflicts of interest. The Supreme Court implemented ethics rules in November, but it does not include an enforcement mechanism. Mr. Biden called its ethics code weak and self-enforced. It's highly unlikely Mr. Biden's proposed changes will be implemented in the coming months. Election day is just 99 days away. I think it's 98 now.
Yeah, 98.
And more importantly, Congress is divided. The president's plans to impose term limits and a code of conduct would require legislative approval from the House and Senate. Republicans narrowly control the House, and GOP lawmakers in both chambers of Congress have denounced Democrats' criticisms of the court, arguing they are part of an effort to delegitimize the Supreme Court following rulings that they dislike. Legislation setting term limits for justices and establishing ethics rules would be unlikely to clear the House, and that's if Republican leaders allowed a floor vote in the first place, which they won't. House Speaker Mike Johnson said in a statement Monday morning that the president's plan is dead on arrival in the House. Additionally, there's a high bar for amending the Constitution. One method for proposing a constitutional amendment requires 2/3 support of both the House and Senate, and another is through a constitutional convention of 2/3 of state legislatures. Ratification requires support from 3/4 of state legislatures. If Democrats were to gain a trifecta, it could clear the way for Congress to enact legislation reforming the Supreme Court. In the Senate, the party would have to significantly widen its majority since 60 votes are required for legislation to advance. Concerns from Democrats in Congress were sparked by reporting about Justice Clarence Thomas's ties to GOP megadonor Harlan Crow, who paid for trips that the justice did not report on annual financial disclosure forms. Thomas said he and Crow have been friends for decades, and the justice didn't believe he was required to report the travel under prior guidelines for personal hospitality. Well, that's the problem, isn't it?
Wow, it is. It is. And there's a lot more to this, because all the stuff that's being brought up, you know, the second season of The Acolyte has a better chance of being read in Congress than anything that's being proposed here. What this is a way to hype up liberals to get excited to vote for Biden, or either that maybe progressives who would vote for Biden, because these things all sound good, but this is just a wish list so that Democrats can say, see, if you support us, we can get this thing done. See, if you really lay down the fire, we can really get this. This is just a wish list. This is all what this is. It's a nothing burger. And if the Democrats really gave a damn about those rulings that the Supreme Court passed that they didn't like, well, then, gee, Democrats, you could have codified Roe v. Wade decades ago, but you chose not to because you chose to fundraise off of it. This is all a wish list and nothing but smoke and mirrors for the Democrats to trick voters.
Well, that's all they do. It's always the Lucy and the football thing. Vote harder. And when there's legislation, when they actually have a supermajority and there's popular legislation and they're out of excuses for why they don't pass it because they have control of all three branches, you know, they drag out a Manchin or a Joe Lieberman, and yeah, it's their fault, a Kristen Sinema. They scapegoat that person. They blame
Blue
it on
Dog
them.
Democrats, Blue Dog Democrats in Obama,
Democrats.
In 2008. You know, these are the same things we see over and over and over again. And the thing is, what I see, especially getting rid of the immunities, what this is another attempt by Democrats to possibly go after Trump. Should he get reelected, they're going to try and impeach him. And once he does step down after 4 years, yes, liberals, I said that. Once he steps down in 4 years, I could see Democrats trying to go after Trump again legally. They want him, they want him in jail so bad. They're willing to sacrifice anything and sell anything just so they can get their petty revenge.
Well, when we had Caleb Maupin on the other night, and I would highly recommend his newly once again available on Amazon book, which I think probably the amount of exposure he got because of this made them think better of it. Having read it, I don't understand why they went after that book in particular. You could have written a much more damning book if he were more concerned about personal attacks on Kamala Harris rather than examining her career in a context of internal deep state politics. That's really what the book is concerned with. No, nothing about Willie Brown, nothing like that. Like he really didn't get into those kinds of personal biographical details. But a point he makes is that the fight playing out between Donald Trump and what Kamala Harris represents is really a fight between this East Coast Rockefeller, you might in a modern sense say Davos kind of quote unquote progressive deep state, a deep state that sees itself as having a kind of almost benign paternalistic relationship to the public interest, and the lower orders of the rich who are more the mining interests, the coal interests, the industrial interests, certain elements of Silicon Valley at this point, who are less about that type of social engineering and much more about immediate profit and lack of regulation. That's their issue with Trump, really.
Yeah. It's a game between oligarchs, and
Right.
we've seen this before. The ancient Romans, the Roman Senate. I mean, do you think they're filled with honorable men? No, these were rich men who cared about their interests. But besides all those ancient empires, we see this story get played out over and over again. But what's really jarring here, what's really pathetic, is that you have corporate media, the absolute power of the internet, and everyone's preaching we have a democracy. What kind of democracy is it in which it's a war between rich people? Because at the end of the day,
It's an oligarchy.
poor folk will never, ever have a seat at the table. They've been conned and tricked into thinking they matter. But as I say on my show, the donors will always supersede the voters, and the donors all want to get what they want. And it's a war of petty kings.
Please clap.